welcome to a new season, first new official episode of Amari Music Talk. I'm Richard Cole, the Amari in Amari Communications, and if you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're a long-time listener, welcome back. Of course, we've had some episodes with, announcing the Diamonds and Pearls box set that's coming October 27th. It is now October, so we are mere weeks away from having that box set in our possession. You see me do a reaction video about the announcement, some other items recently regarding all the vault tracks that have been previewed thus far. So if you haven't had a chance to check those out, by all means check those out. But this is the first new episode of Amari Music Talk. If you're new to the channel, again, like I said, welcome. If you've been a long time listener, welcome back. And don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. And if you're on Patreon, become a Patreon supporter. So this is a new season, very excited to jump in. And what I want to talk about this episode, it's kind of a follow-up to the recent controversy with Jan Werner and the comments he made in promotion of his book. I was, offended by the comments. If you haven't had a chance to check that video out on what my view of everything was, by all means check that out. But what I wanted to do, and what I promised in that video as well as the follow-up video to that, was for this show to acknowledge music that I like, or music that I love. And I think that the people that he picked for his book, most of them, yeah, rightfully so, deserve that type of honorable mention. A few of them I've got some personal opinions about, but this is about building and healing, and like I said, this show, I just want to talk about what I like. So what I want to do with this episode is basically showcase who I think are the masters. And in putting this together, I mean, there's so many great artists across the board, male, female, black, white, all over the world. There are great artists and musicians, and their music, has had an impact, or just their worldview along with their music. Or sometimes music is just designed just to feel good, and maybe just their worldview is inspiring. It's not played out in the song so much, but just their worldview, period. So why I titled this The Masters, including but not limited to, meaning that I picked about 10 artists that I personally feel, some of them I've got the majority of their records or all of their records, and then there's one or two I may not have certain albums, but I've heard certain songs and I recognize the impact that they've had, and to me they are just as deserving to be in any book titled The Masters, not just a few, to promote a kind of a segregation in music. And I think, because of things like Rolling Stone and like MTV in its earlier inception, it kind of created this programming that, once you had younger generations come about, or maybe that division had such a long reach over decades that a lot of us just forgot, or just prejudiced by, like I said, your limited view. If you're in a certain area in the world, you may not understand the impact, but a lot of this music from the 60s and the 70s, it did go hand in hand. And you look back at a lot of those old shows, and you look at a lot of detractors of what was rock and roll. I mean, Motown was synonymous with rock and roll because you had the Beatles covering it. You had all the British bands covering Motown songs or Stax songs, or they were covering the Shirelles and the Ronettes and you know um, many groups. You've had Elvis cover black music. So at one point, it all was synonymous. It was all the same. It's just that between, maybe not always a Rolling Stone, but magazine, but like I said, MTV in its early days, corporate takeover of record companies and radio stations, to where there was no longer those independent voices basically promoting what they liked. Everything had to be a packaged product, or everything had to be given a name, or funk music being, or funk, soul, R&B being lumped in with disco and all the racism and prejudice associated with anti-disco and all of that. So like I said, with this show, this episode, or starting with this episode, we're going to start, like I said, anybody that keeps pumping in negativity or trying to pump out positivity, we're going to pump the positivity right back in. So we're going to start with, again, my list of the masters, my version of the masters, including, but not limited to, these artists. And there's no particular order, there's no ranking system, because like I said, they're all synonymous. Of course, obviously, some have had more impact than others. Some have had a direct influence on various cultures, or American culture, or world music culture, over the years. Some have had an indirect effect as well. So we're going to start with, of course, many listeners of this show have carried over from the Amari Purple Talk days. So we're just going to start with this artist. And, like I said, no particular order, no ranking, nobody's number one, nobody's last place. We're just kind of just off the top of the dome. But because of the majority of the fan base here, we're going to start with Prince. And, there's so much that can be said about this artist. And it's not lost on a lot of, so-called rock artists. A lot of, Bowie has had nice things to say about him. Frank Zappa's had nice things to say. Eric Clapton has had nice things to say. So they recognize the talent. But I think in the broader scheme, what gets lost is because of the image, and the more popular subject matter of especially his 80s material. So in the eyes of the mainstream, there may not be that recognition, or a lot of it's taken for granted, or because they don't rank him as high on the list of guitar players or anything like that. So I think a lot gets lost in translation. I think a lot gets lost in the shuffle. And it takes, hopefully time and more releases from the Prince estate, as well as myself, other podcasters, people that have written books like Dwayne Tudall, to, document not only the musical impact, but, his impact on the music industry. You see where you have Taylor Swift, who lost control of her original masters, took a page out of the Prince playbook. Of course, Prince didn't totally go all the way with it like Taylor Swift has done, but she's gone back and has re-recorded her catalog and saying, hey, hey, if you like the original, hey, go ahead and get the original. I'm not going to stop you, but if you buy this, and I own this master, I own the publisher, I own this, and the money's going to go to me. Where you do buy that, even though it's the original, that money's going to go to somebody else, and I'm not going to take a lion's share of the profit. And Prince was one of those that fought very, very hard to get ownership of his musical destiny and eventually control of his master recordings. So, the way he went about it with the name change to the symbol, during the time that was going on, it was confusing. It was frustrating. Not everybody got it, or it took a few people a long time to get the point of it, but that was met with a lot of ridicule, and not unlike when Muhammad Ali became Muhammad Ali and no longer, his birth name of Cassius Clay. There was a lot of that pushback. But when you, build the success and you prove your point, then you get that respect. And I think once he was able to get certain control, change his name back to Prince, then within a few years, then the industry had to catch up and say, hey, okay, yeah, we respect you. So whenever he had to do a record deal with a major label, it was on his terms, and he was able to get the control that he fought for. It took a lot of sacrifice, but also the musicianship. Again, it gets taken for granted. Now, Prince isn't the first person to play all the instruments on an album or a record. You have probably the two most famous examples. Paul McCartney has done it. Stevie Wonder has done it. I can't think of the guy, but the band Boston, like the first album wasn't the band, it was all the one guy that did it. He built the band later. So you have those examples that have predated Prince, or also too another Shuggie Otis was basically Prince before Prince. Young dude playing all the instruments. You got to check out his material as well. Definitely check out Shuggie Otis, but definitely Prince. Like I said, not the first person to do that, but maybe perhaps the youngest to do it, starting off, and to build from R&B success to kind of cult status, critical acclaim with Dirty Mind, to that slow climb to pop acceptance with, starting Controversy, but definitely 1999, especially Purple Rain, which is another thing. I think because of the magnitude of Purple Rain and the Purple Rain myth, I think people just focus on that part and really don't take the time to recognize the genius, except certain music critics. The Parade album was when the critics really put that genius label on him. We knew it for the longest, long before then, but post Purple Rain, this was the first time that the critics were like, oh yeah, this is a genius, with the Parade album, Sign of the Times album. He has gone in various directions after that, like a Frank Zappa that does different things. He can play rock, he can play funky, he can play jazz. He does orchestral, or did orchestral arrangements during his lifetime. Prince was similar. 1 minute, especially in the 2000s, the early 2000s, you were getting more jazz material from Prince, and kind of heavier Miles Davis / Santana like sounds from Prince. And like I said, just going in different directions and constantly challenging us. And then towards the end of his career, finding that balance between the contemporary and his own personal style. So, like I said, we go for days on end on this show and the upcoming Purple Notes Unveiled podcast too, talking about Prince's musical genius. So if you're new to this channel. If you're more like classic rock fan or just not aware fully of Prince, I urge you to check out previous episodes of Amari Music Talk, Amari Purple Talk. Like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, become a Patreon supporter, and take a deeper dive. You won't regret it. But that's Prince. So that's, like I said, no particular order in this, and no one's number one and no one's in last place or anything like that. So, but that was Prince. Now the next master on the list is John Lennon. And I'd probably say, if I listen to Prince the most, depends on what day it is, then the Beatles are probably second, because it'll be Prince, it'll be Marvin Gaye, it'll be James Brown, it'll be Parliament Funkadelic, Sly and the Family Stone. That's kind of where I am, maybe some of the solo records artists. But in heavy rotation from 1976 on, at the age of 10, it's the Beatles, and then of course their solo work as well. But pretty much since my college days that I really focused in more on John Lennon. I didn't know that much about, the Beatles I did. And by the time I was 12, they had a book that kind of really explained not only their career, but kind of like a lot of their solo material as well. So I knew the albums and things, and I remember in like fall of 1980, was starting to hear, John Lennon's coming back with an album. He's coming back with an album. Where I've been buying Paul McCartney and Wings during that period. And was like, okay, well, cool. If he's coming out with something new, this will be my chance to finally check him out. See, what he's like. I enjoy the stuff with the Beatles, but like I said, I was really just buying Paul McCartney and Wings stuff. But unfortunately, I didn't get Double Fantasy until after John Lennon was murdered. But based on that, I liked, what I heard. I liked sort of the evolution, the contemporary it sounded fresh. I'd always read about Yoko Ono's stuff, but never heard it. Heard that, and that stuff on Double Fantasy wasn't so bad. I get from reading other things, but I didn't really get into either one of their earlier albums until much later. But it wasn't until college that I read a biography on John Lennon, and just kind of certain parallels with his childhood, were very similar to mine. And I was like, oh, okay, so there was sort of that bonding on that level of it. And by then I started to seek out some of the other things, but like Plastic Ono Band, Imagine, but over the years had managed to collect, whether on CD or vinyl, the vast majority of his solo catalog. But before then, so kind of before buying Double Fantasy, I've read interviews, especially that famous Lennon Remembers that Jan Werner had done for Rolling Stone, and you've heard me comment about that. But when the time that I was reading that was sort of almost, like, whoa, it was riveting. He wasn't pulling any punches. He was cutting some folks up in that interview, and for a long time, that was sort of like the definitive interview, the one in which Jan Werner has been milking to death. I think there's like 3 editions of that interview that have been published, whether it's hardback or paperback or something. And I've bought it, one edition at one point. I think one of the first editions. I don't have it anymore, um, but like I said, I kind of got an understanding, and that was kind of influential. But like I said, just kind of his honesty, his worldview. To me, him and Marvin Gaye, I think, are kind of the most open. Whether it's in their music, you get an open book. Their interviews, you get the truth. They don't really hide behind anything. I think one of the things with going back to Prince is that, of course, in the early days, he was trying to be mysterious and cryptic, and it didn't always come off well in interviews. But as he matured, um, as he began to take on certain causes, whether his own personal cause of artistic freedom or the state of the world, whatever was going on at that time, I think he got better at you know being open about those things. It wasn't that he was never. And the thing that bugged me about the Jan Werner comments, this whole thing about articulation, is not that any of these artists weren't articulate. They definitely were, and they definitely were intelligent. But the thing is that you can't have this narrow view of the world. Just because somebody has a different idea or a different sound, it doesn't mean that it's not relative. Um, even some of the music now, yeah, being 57 now. I mean, of course, there's some stuff like, okay, yeah, I get the music industry is pulling all the strings now. They're back in control, and most of these artists are under their spell and all this other stuff. But there's still some good ideas that are coming through. There's still some good sounds that come through. I'll listen to something and go, well, that's a good sound. But it's no longer my place. It's the next generation. Just like people were young when the Beatles were around, or people were young in the 80s when Prince was Purple Rain and all of this. That's our generation. That's the previous generation. Also, too, we're kind of this first generation. Um, most of us that are born in the 60s, where maybe half of us, our parents would listen. We were kind of on the same accord. Where you had when rock and roll first started, it didn't matter who was doing it, black or white. There was some segments of the population that just weren't having it. They were scared to death of it. And I think, we live in an age now, we've had punk. I think hip hop, even to this day, it gets a lot of hate because now these people are starting to sound like their parents or their grandparents. Oh, hip hop's not music. Oh, it's terrible. I can't. Well, guess what? Yes, it is. Just like punk is music, just like reggae's music, funk is music. Just because it's not some long, big, stringy haired dude with a guitar doesn't mean it's not music and that it's not cool. Because trust me, we got some brothers that can go just if not just as well, oftentimes better. That's right, I said it. And some of those cats deserve to be mentioned, but just because people mistake funk for disco, they don't get that respect. But getting back to John Lennon, like I said, his stance on peace and the situation with him fighting to stay in this country, because Nixon being paranoid, thought he was a threat, thought he was going to have all the young people, because 1972 was the first time that 18-year-olds could vote. They lowered the voting age from, I think, was it 21 at first? They lowered it to 18. And you look at what's going on with Taylor Swift now. Certain people are scared because she's got millions and millions of fans, and that fan bases. We think our different fan bases are loyal. That fan base is something else. And and if you channel that energy, or if you influence people in a positive way, then hopefully, this generation, maybe they can be the ones to sort it out first by voting, and then, if they mature well, or most of them, or even some of them mature and get wise in the right way, be the ones to be that catalyst for change, to where, we're not hating so much, or maybe we can start to finally get rid of racism and sexism, and get rid of all these perversions, and get rid of all this evil, get rid of most of it. Maybe they can be that catalyst that can maybe get us, inches closer to that type of living. But John Lennon was definitely one of those first. Another artist I'm going to bring up before him. I think, even if there were certain albums of his that didn't work, or I mean, not didn't work, but weren't major sellers, or they didn't stand up to an Imagine, or didn't stand up to a Give Peace a Chance, or Plastic Ono Band album, he still constantly had something interesting to say. In fact, all four of them, the Beatles, are pretty interesting people. I can read or watch interviews on them just as much as I can listen to the music. And definitely, I think, as far as that Jan Werner book or whatever, then yes, definitely, I think one of the intelligent ones, more so than two or three other people on that list tapped for that book. But for sure, like I said, John Lennon as a Beatle, as a solo artist, that impact cannot be, understated. Definitely, it's it's very interesting, inspirational artist. And from John, we're going to move to Marvin Gaye. Like I said earlier, to me, where you had John Lennon doing Imagine, Marvin Gaye had What's Going On. Both of those songs still relevant today. That album, in a lot of ways, it's great that it's still relevant, but it's also sad that it's still relevant because of the subject matter. Because, again, getting back to articulation, nothing wrong with what John Lennon was putting down. I mean, he called it like he saw it too. But I think Marvin Gaye, more so, he hit it more on the head intelligently with What's Going On. Because it's just slick, it's smooth, it's serious all the way through. It covers the gamut of everything on the planet. Vietnam War at that time, which you can just juxtapose with any conflict that's going on now, or any conflict we've had in the last 15, 20 years. Inner city blues, look at what we've had with it's too many names at this point, with what's happened, George Floyd, Freddie Gray, we've been so, that it's sad. Like I said, it's great that we still have music like that can make an impact, or that is just as relevant, but it's also sad that it's just as relevant, because it's still happening. Poverty is still a problem, because you get the homeless that's multiplying now and getting out of hand. How do we feed people? How do we give people homes? Addiction, Flying High in the Friendly Sky, that track it speaks to addiction. Getting back, with John Lennon with Cold Turkey, that's another one that speaks to addiction. And I think both hit it on the head equally, as far as the emotion behind it. Both, yeah, I think both work in that case. But yeah, and it didn't really stop there. I mean, you've had things like Trouble Man, not just the soundtrack, but just the song itself, the title song itself. Again, it speaks to where, it even ended up being a pop culture reference in Captain America Winter Soldier, which I was always confused why they had the Sam Wilson character bring up Trouble Man, because it's just the one song. But I thought it would have made more sense to say the What's Going On album, because to me that that would have illustrated to one Steve Rogers everything that he's missed being in the ice, for 70 years. I think that album as a whole, I think that would have been a better. Again, I don't know if that's the writers of that, if they, again, it's I guess it's that sort of I don't even know what I want to call it. It's an oversight for sure. Too bad you can't go reshoot that. But that's just my personal preference in regards to that scene. But I think them doing a pop culture reference with the What's Going On album as a whole, as opposed to, but I guess maybe they couldn't get the rights to What's Going On. They could only get the rights because they do play the song at the end. When Steve Rogers is in the hospital recovering, Sam Wilson's there and he's playing Trouble Man, while he's unconscious. So I guess it might have been a rights issue, but again, just my personal nitpick about it. But getting back to Marvin Gaye as an artist, there's an album, if you're not familiar with it, most deep cut fans are, but it's his last Motown album titled In Our Lifetime. And in between What's Going On and In Our Lifetime, he was able to, he recorded numerous very sensual albums. The Let's Get It On album, the I Want You album, powerful. It's just not sex for sex sake. It's, like I said, it's romantic and when it needs to be. It's intimate when it needs to be. It's sexual when it needs to be. And, that whole, his whole duality in life, the secular versus the spiritual, again, was able to articulate that with What's Going On, followed up by Let's Get It On, to do an I Want You. Then, although this was done out of spite, it's still, it's looked back on as sort of a masterpiece now. But the Hear My Dear album, that was just solely recorded out of spite and intended to be used as a divorce settlement. But, Wham's Everything She Wants owes its entire success to Marvin Gaye's When Did I Stop Loving You, When Did You Stop Loving Me. Play those tracks back to back, you will see what I'm talking about with that. But yeah, heavily influential. And not just the 70s output, the 60s. He's one of Motown's biggest stars, right up there with the Temptations and the Supremes. Duets with Tammy Terrell. I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Stubborn Kind of Fella, Hitchhike. His cover of Yesterday is probably the best cover of Yesterday ever. And again, if you haven't had a chance to check it out, by all means, check that out as well. But also, like I said, his last Motown album, A Lifetime, it kind of goes back to some of those spiritual themes. There are some secular, sensual themes involved in that as well. But the best track to listen to is Love Me Now or Love Me Later. And the song is literally a conversation between God and the devil. And it is one of the most, y'all can keep Black Sabbath. Y'all can keep whatever, whatever death, whatever, give me that track. It says it just as better, good or better than than any one of those. So by all means, definitely check that out. I always play that for people just to wig people out a little bit, because it's so deep, it's so profound, it makes so much sense. If you're one that's seeking balance, that's one you need to listen to. So, like I said, that's Marvin Gaye. So the next on the list, the next master on the list is the hardest working man in show business, Mr. Dynamite, Soul Brother number one, the godfather of soul, James Brown. Now, like I said, in the 50s and probably the early 60s, pre-British invasion, rock and roll was everything. It wasn't just Elvis. It wasn't just the Everly Brothers. It wasn't just Jerry Lee Lewis. You recognize Little Richard and Chuck Berry, as the foundations. You recognize Fats Domino as the foundation. But as you got into the 60s, because you no longer had either of those. Like, Elvis was in the army. Chuck Berry was serving time. Little Richard turned to religion. Jerry Lee Lewis married his cousin, his 13-year-old cousin at that. Crazy times, folks. And, rock and roll didn't have that edge that when it started. So you kind of start in the late 50s, you kind of had like the Fabians, and Paul Ankas, Frankie Avalons. To me, I think the coolest out of that bunch was really Rick Nelson. He kind of kept a little bit. He was still kind of, because he was on television with his family, he was still television friendly, and he still was kind of clean like those other artists were, but he had like the best rock and roll session musicians as his band, James Burton on guitar and musicians like that. So yeah, he was kind of clean, but that band, he had the band, so he didn't get quite the respect overall, but in a way he did. But getting back, by the early 60s, you had like the Drifters, you had the Shirelles, and like groups like that, even the Ronettes. You had like what they called the Brill Building, and it was like this building in New York, where basically like all the sort of what they call Tin Pan Alley songwriters, it'd be like you in an office, or a bunch of people in an office, everybody's got a piano, and you just cranking out songs every day and hope that, okay, well, this artist is going to sing this song and you're going to make, it goes number one and you'll make a lot of money with that. That's where you had like your Lieber and Strollers, Goffin and King, and Man and Wild. I think Burt Bacharach was part of that too at some point. But with those groups, the songs that they were writing for the Drifters and for the Shirelles, that was still considered rock and roll. And those songs were number one on the pop charts as well as they were on the R&B charts. And those records, like I said, were indistinguishable. It didn't become like this division like we know it now with music. In this part, they were capturing people, which, Motown kind of maybe influenced by that a little bit, and had the slogan, the sound of young America. Because, the same thing with the Motown songs. Everybody was listening to it, as a whole. It wasn't just one group of people listening to it. But then when you started to get this British invasion, with the Beatles and the Stones and the Who and the Kinks coming over and just wrecking shop, Motown was probably Motown, maybe Stax. They were the only ones that were kind of keeping up. You know, the Everly Brothers, they like out the window. Um, it was hard for Chuck Berry over here, but then he had to go to England and do shows over in England because, you know, since the Beatles and Stones covered his songs, he was more popular in England than over here. But, you know, they were trying to sweep Little Richard under the rug, and they were trying to sweep Chuck Berry under the rug over here, where, you know, the Beatles were kind to say, hey, you know, nah, we're influenced by black music. We love black music. We love Chuck Berry. We love Little Richard. We love Motown. And, you know, that's one of those things, like, you know, when you hear the Motown stories of them going down south. The first year, the seats were segregated. The next year, they were integrated. But that British invasion provided some major, major competition. The only artist besides, like I said, Motown, Stax, because you know the Shirelles couldn't hang and the Drifters could no longer hang. So the only, I would say, single black artist to hold their own because he was doing his own thing independent of everybody. The British invasion, Motown, Stax, James Brown just decided, hey, he's going to create his own genre. And that became the super dead heavy funk. He's the first. He is the godfather of soul, of funk, and probably the first major black artist, a major black person to financially reach heights that very few black people were able to attain, let alone an entertainer in those days. You know, his business acumen, you know, for somebody that had only a sixth grade education, he had the street smarts and developed a business acumen and developed a hustle that I think really, in a lot of cases, could only work for him just because of his attitude, his mindset. You know, where, you know, it was hard to say keep certain band members most of the time, or if he felt like, well, look, I achieved this, you could do this too. But it's like, no, there's only one James Brown, only you could do that. And, you know, that might have caused some issues over the years, but that was the first. You know, he was the first. And his influence, you know, on Michael Jackson. You know, there would be, without a James Brown, there would be no Michael Jackson. There'd be no Prince. You know, I think Sly Stone would be one-dimensional. You know, it probably would, because he was also influenced by the Stax sound as well. So I think, you know, you wouldn't have had that if that James Brown is sort of like a force to look up to you know, to take funk itself to the next level. Like I said, Sly would have been one-dimensional. But yeah, I mean, definitely Michael Jackson. You know, the Jackson 5 before being signed with Motown. You know, they were playing the so-called the Chitlin circuit and playing the Apollo, and they would open for James, and they would open for Jackie Wilson. In fact, you know, James was able to go to places that not even Jackie Wilson, because really, you know, truth be told, Jackie Wilson was really bigger than Elvis. It's just that you dang sure weren't going to have, you know, the kids, you know, white kids, the parents weren't going to have their kids screaming at Jackie Wilson. You know, they weren't about to let that happen. That wasn't a thing in those days. So, you know, Jackie Wilson's career only got so far, but James was able to go to, like I said, to, because he was so far to the left of what everybody else was doing. He literally created his own lane. And you know, a young Michael Jackson would watch from the wings and watch every move that James Brown made. He would watch every move that Jackie Wilson made. And you would, you know, that you see that, you watch some clips of some of Michael's moves. You see the James Brown in it. You see the Jackie Wilson, like if he takes off a jacket or a shirt, the way he does that, and the spins, and some of the drops. You know, some of the drops are more Jackie Wilson because I don't know. Michael used to do splits. You see that Motown audition tape, he does splits, but you haven't really seen him do splits. But he does that drop like Jackie Wilson does that drop. Prince was more the split, did more of the splits in those days. But so not only as an entertainer, James Brown's influence on Michael Jackson, but just the business sense, where Michael was even to take something like that to where virtually no entertainer has gone before. The business acumen. Like I said, when I put this list together, like I said, it's including but not limited to. And like I said, there's a whole lot of other artists. I'm kind of slipping some in kind of as we're talking because, a lot of them have either an impact on one another or, like I said, it could be a cultural impact, or just the, musical history, the change, the influences on one from the other. So, like I said, a lot of different artists that can be included in this list. But yeah, definitely, Michael was a consideration for this list too. There's a book I have to finish reading I think it's called Michael Jackson Inc. That really talks about his business accomplishments. But that might be a focus for a different episode. But definitely, like I said, James Brown, the fact that he owned radio stations at one point, the fact that he owned restaurants at one point, like I said, changed the face of black music, which, the funk, you have some rock groups that can get funky when they want to, and that's just as influential. As a listener, and like I said, we're all capable of being music snobs, but when you shut down the importance of another artist just because you love this one artist or a certain segment of artists so much, then it kind of, it's okay to like what you like, and music is subjective. But, like I say, when you react negatively to an artist because they're different or whatever, then, there's some potential harm that can ensue, on a spiritual level with that. But like I said, definitely, James Brown is a major influence. Like I said, and hardest working man in show business, Soul Brother #1, the Godfather of Soul, Mr. Dynamite. There's so much. Like I said, we'll definitely do more episodes on James as well. But as far as again a cultural significance, the concert at Boston Gardens in 1968. If you can go to his James Brown YouTube channel, I think you can catch that in its entirety. But they did have different segments of that concert as well. It still may be available on DVD. But which is this? This DVD, it has the concert at Boston Garden. Also comes with a documentary about that, because this was a concert that took place. He was scheduled to stop there on the tour, but this was right around the time when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and there were riots ensued in major cities across the country. I think some concerts were canceled before then, but there was definitely talk of canceling the concert in Boston. But then came the idea that, well, if he goes ahead with the show, and then if we televise it, then that might keep people off of the streets. And, for the most part, it did. It was very quiet. Nothing went down. Everybody stayed home and watched this concert. And, I highly recommend it. If you haven't seen it, if you can still find this. This is the box set. I think you might be able to get Live at the Apollo and at least the documentary. The third, not Live at the Apollo, Live at the Boston Garden. The Live at the Apollo is a bonus DVD that came with this set. I don't think that's available, but like I said, go to James Brown's YouTube channel, and I think you might be able to see the Boston Gardens concert. Actually, a more expanded version, I think, because this only shows the James Brown, because but his review, I think some of the opening acts that he had on tour with him on the YouTube channel, I think you can see that in its entirety. But if you can't find that, then I highly recommend Mr. Dynamite. It was a documentary that was on HBO quite a few years ago, not long after the release of the biopic Get On Up, with starring Chadwick Boseman. Peace to Chadwick Boseman, T'Challa. But yeah, definitely check those out for sure. So moving on, our next master is the great Stevie Wonder. And how could, as a Rolling Stone, how could you not? I mean, I'm sure he has been interviewed for Rolling Stone. There have been some good reporters or journalists as well as photographers that have worked for Rolling Stone. But, I think that whole thing with the book was that these are just people that Jan Werner has personally interviewed. So how could you not take the time to talk to a Stevie Wonder yourself? There's so much that you could say about Stevie Wonder. Again, a lot of these artists will probably have to just do a segment, do an episode, either, spotlighting their career, spotlighting certain albums, or doing a series of episodes, on a different album or two. But, his career in the 60s, with Motown is great enough. Fingertips Part 2, Uptight, Signed, Sealed, Delivered, My Cherie Amour, For Once in My Life. That's enough right there. There's groups that had the same number, Motown acts that have had the same number of hits but hadn't had a hit since, that are fondly remembered. But, the 70s, and again, when I talk about, I think what's lost on a lot of people is that you can kind of see there is a little bit of cultural exchange taking place in the 60s and the 70s. It wasn't like the 50s where you had these record companies taking somebody like a Pat Boone and having Pat Boone cover Little Richard just to sell to a certain segment of people. I think the 60s, like I said, starting with those groups like the Drifters and the Shirelles, that music captured people. Those songs were on all kind of radio stations in those days, and you had the kids on American Bandstand dancing and enjoying that, and having those acts and enjoying those acts on the screen, just as much as any inner city, that either had the records or they were listening to it on the radio. It was equal. I'd have to check the charts to see exactly if certain songs were number one on both charts, but they were definitely top five on both charts. If one was number one on R&B, then the other was, on pop it was number two or number three or something. But they were in your living rooms, they were on your speakers, they were on your radios in those days. Um, but like I said, there's this cultural exchange, for what things that Bob Dylan was writing about. You also had Curtis Mayfield writing about that stuff as well. Um, Curtis is another one on the list too. So, heavy social commentary, but beautiful songs. Same thing with Bob Dylan. Writing songs about Medgar Evers, writing songs like "Blowing in the Wind," "Hard Rain's Gonna Fall," songs like that. And there was this exchange, and for somebody like Stevie Wonder, he was noticing the things that Bob Dylan was writing about, or Curtis Mayfield was writing about. The strides that the Beatles were making. We think of albums. We look at an Earth, Wind, and Fire album. And the concept. From the cover art to, you know, the songs are meant to be listened to as a collection. Yeah, they had hit singles, but the Beatles were kind of that first, as far as rock and roll or pop music or any music, modern music from the 60s on. They were that first to say, okay, well, we're not going to have just the hit singles and a bunch of filler on an album. It's like the album has to be, the album is an art form. They were one of the first to do that, and that was not lost on Stevie. So as he was getting older, upon his 21st birthday, he wanted more creative control. He didn't want to just write about, oh, I love you, you love me, and all. He didn't want to just write just simple love songs. He wanted to comment on the state of the world, or how his worldview, he wanted to get that across. And when he was granted that freedom with Motown, man, did it ever work. Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfilling Its First Finale, Songs in the Key of Life. I don't, and it wasn't just, where you had things like Living for the City, like I said, it covered everything. I mean, Songs in the Key of Life, that album alone, that transcended anything that a Sgt. Pepper did, or even A Dark Side of the Moon, or you name any concept album. That's an album that literally captured life onto vinyl in those days, and even now. Um, yeah, that should be mentioned in the same breath as a Sgt. Pepper or a Dark Side of the Moon, or any other album of significance. Just because it's not from the suburbs or whatever, or you listening to it in the suburbs or whatever, it doesn't mean that it's any less relevant or less intelligent or less articulate. And like I said, it's not just focusing on one segment of life. Yeah, there's things like Pastime Paradise, there's Village Ghetto Land on that album, but As is universal as a song. Anybody that can say that they've ever felt love, and you listen to that and hear what the words are saying, if you've ever felt an emotion about anyone, that's that's it in a nutshell. Just that one song. Things like If It's Magic, love's in need of love today. How needed is something like that today with